Holly Dunn knew she was going to die. It was August 1997 in Lexington, Kentucky. Bound beside a dark set of railroad tracks, the 20-year-old college student had just watched her boyfriend, Chris Maier, be brutally attacked. Now she was alone in the dark with his killer. She couldn't overpower him, she couldn't outrun him, and no one was close enough to hear her scream. So Holly relied on pure survival instinct. She talked. She shared stories about her family, her life, and all the people who loved her, hoping that if she could make this man see her as a person, that maybe he might let her live. And while she fought to keep herself human, her mind cataloged every detail: the sound of his voice, the features of his face, the specific ways that he spoke. She was building a mental case file, preparing for the smallest possibility of tomorrow. And when he finally walked away, he left her behind, believing that she was dead. Holly didn't know that her attacker was Ángel Maturino Reséndiz, the serial murderer who would soon terrify the nation and be known as the Railroad Killer. She only knew that against all odds, she had survived the night. But escaping those tracks was just her first battle. What followed was a decade-long journey through terror, profound grief, survivor's guilt, and the slow, grueling process of reclaiming her life. This is the story of an incredible escape, a key piece to a massive manhunt, and the enduring strength that it takes to rebuild after going through something unimaginable. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, Season 5, Survivors. Before Holly Dunn became known as the sole survivor of the Railroad Killer, she was just Holly. In August of 1997, she was a 20-year-old junior studying finance at the University of Kentucky. She was raised on 13 acres in Indiana alongside her younger sister, Heather, and Holly lived the life of a typical college student, figuring out her future, navigating young adulthood, grounded by a family who adored her. True crime often introduces people at the absolute worst moments in their lives, through a police mugshot, a hospital cart, a grim headline. Everything a person was before the tragedy was compressed into a passing footnote. But Holly Dunn had lived a beautiful, full 20 years before a stranger stepped out of the darkness. She had plans, relationships, a distinctive personality. By nature, Holly was deeply empathetic and an intuitive communicator. When facing people, her default setting was to connect, talk to them, listen. Later, when she found herself in unimaginable danger, those traits became her lifesaver. She reasoned with her attacker. She asked him questions. She made him, or at least tried to, make him see her as a living, breathing human with a family waiting for her at home. It's so easy to look back at and label those tactics as an emergency survival mechanism. But they weren't traits gifted to her by a serial killer. They belonged to Holly long before she ever met him. That capacity for connection, emotional intelligence, and just a fierce drive to get back to the people she loved existed long before that night. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz altered the trajectory of Holly's life. But he doesn't get credit for creating the woman who survived him. On Thursday, August 28th, 1997, just 2 days into the fall semester, Holly stepped out to do what millions of college students do without a second thought. She went to a party with her 21-year-old boyfriend, Chris Maier. And before we go any further, I want to talk about Chris. One of my core goals this season is to ensure that the people in these stories don't become supporting characters in the biographies of the men who hurt them. Chris was so much more than just a young man who happened to be standing beside Holly Dunn on August 28th, 1997. He was 21 years old. He was a junior at the University of Kentucky, and Holly met him earlier that summer at a friend's birthday. She noticed him immediately. He was tall, good-looking, remarkably easygoing, And by the time the fall semester began, they were dating, still a very new couple, in that lighthearted phase of figuring out where things might go in the future. Holly remembered Chris as a laid-back and down-to-earth guy. He loved being outdoors, and he possessed the kind of effortless nature that made him seem like he never had a care in the world. That Thursday night was entirely ordinary. After they dropped by an off-campus party that ended up being kind of boring, Chris packed a couple beers into his backpack. He and Holly left with two of Chris's friends, and they walked toward the nearby railroad tracks. It was a pretty common spot for college students to hang out. They sat by the railway, drank beer, they talked, they placed pennies on the tracks in hopes that the passing train would flatten them. Eventually, Chris's friends decided to head home, but Holly and Chris stayed behind, talking about the weekend, their classes, and the semester coming ahead. Whenever tragedy strikes, people have a frustrating tendency to work backward through the victim's decisions, searching for the exact moment where they made a mistake. Why were you out so late? Why did you leave that party? Why did you stay by those tracks? That's just hindsight trying to manufacture a warning label where none exists. Holly and Chris weren't taking a dangerous risk. These were two college kids enjoying a late summer night near their college campus. Chris had no reason to believe that those were the last plans he would ever make, and Holly had no idea that decades later, she would still be carrying the memory of the young man who was sitting beside her. As the night began to wind down, the two of them stood up and they started to walk back toward campus. And hidden nearby, beyond an electrical box, was a stranger. Nothing Holly or Chris did put him there. Nothing they did made them responsible for what happened next. They simply had the terrible, arbitrary misfortune of stepping into his path. The first thing that Holly remembered was the sheer shock of it. She and Chris didn't see the man coming because he didn't walk up to them. He was crouching beside this electrical box just waiting. And when he stepped out and began demanding money, Holly and Chris thought they understood what was happening here. They were being robbed. It was scary, but there's a logic to it. Give him what he wants and he'll leave you alone. They told him the truth. We don't have any money. We're broke college kids. The semester just started. We spent all our money on books. That's when their attacker pressed a sharp object. Holly wasn't sure whether it was an ice pick or a screwdriver, but he put it up against Chris, and the man ordered Chris onto his hands and knees, pulling Chris's backpack toward him. At first, Holly assumed that he was just searching for hidden wallets, but then she saw what he was really doing. He wasn't searching the bag. He was using the straps to tie Chris's hands very tightly behind his back. That single detail shifted the reality of the situation instantly. An opportunistic mugger wants your wallet. He wants your car keys. He doesn't take the time to tie you up. Desperate to find a rational exit, Holly started offering everything they had. We have credit cards. We have ATM. We'll give you the pins. Our car is parked nearby. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward her. He pulled her belt off of her pants and he tied her hands behind her back. Then he tied her ankles and tore strips of fabric and gagged them. When he shoved the cloth into Holly's mouth, though, she reflexively stuck her tongue out, a small instinctual act of defiance, and it kept the gag from fully securing. He then dragged Chris away from the gravel tracks and down into the tall grass, and then pulled Holly down right alongside of him. Just minutes earlier, she'd been sitting under the stars, laughing with her boyfriend about the upcoming semester. Now she was bound, gagged, and staring into the darkness beside him. And she silently began reciting what she believed would be her last prayer. The illusion of the robbery vanished. Whatever this man that dragged them into the grass intended to do, it wasn't about money. And for the first time that night, Holly said to herself, I'm going to die here. Holly was right. This wasn't a robbery. And the man dragged Holly farther into the grass. Bound hands and feet, the two students would whisper frantically in the dark whenever their captor disappeared into the darkness. Can you run? Can you break free? At one point, Holly did manage to free her hands, but her ankles stayed tied. Knowing she couldn't outrun him, she made a deliberate choice to fight back with her mind. She started studying his face, his build, his voice, his accent, the distinct marks on his body. Even as she silently prayed, believing that she was going to die, part of her brain couldn't stop planning for a future where she survived. She dug her fingernails into the dirt, trying to break them off into the earth so that if crime investigators ever came by here, they would know that she was here. Then the man turned his attention to Chris. He picked up a 52-pound rock, raised it high above his head, and brought it down in one quick movement onto Chris Mauer's head. He was not killed instantly. As Chris struggled to breathe in his final moments, Holly begged the man to check on him. He ignored her, and Holly knew she was next. Rather than freeze, Holly started talking. "Who are you? Why are you here? What do you need? Can I help you?" She told him about her family and the people who were waiting for her at home. She asked him, "Do you have family? Do you have friends?" Desperately searching for a shred of humanity in this guy. If she could make him see her as a daughter and a sister rather than a nameless target, maybe he would hesitate for just a moment. She begged for her life. She promised she wouldn't tell anyone, and didn't stop him. He began to sexually assault her, and Holly kicked, screamed, and fought with every ounce of strength she had, only stopping when he held a weapon to her neck and stabbed her, warning her how easily he could take her life. Realizing that physical resistance would only get her killed quicker, Holly pivoted. She focused on collecting the information, and when the assault ended, Holly begged for him to put her pants back on. She didn't want the police to find her exposed, and she didn't want her parents to see her that way in crime scene photos. Amazingly, he complied and pulled her pants back on. Then he picked up a heavy wooden board and he struck Holly in the head and face about 5 or 6 times. Then, as she raised her hand to try and shield herself, he flipped her over and he struck her in the back of the head another 5 or 6 times. Eventually, she lost consciousness. Leaving her face pressed in the dirt, her breathing was very shallow, and her attacker assumed that he had killed her, and he just walked away into the night. When Holly woke up, her injuries were catastrophic. She had a broken jaw, a fractured eye socket, severe head and facial trauma, a stab wound to her neck, and yet even through the agony, her mind remained sharp. She immediately began reciting the events. She immediately began reciting the details so she wouldn't forget them. Wavy black hair, wire-rimmed glasses, wiry build, scars, tattoos, Mexican accent. When detectives arrived at her hospital bed hours later, Holly didn't just give them a description. She had a blueprint. Luck always plays a role in surviving an attack that's meant to kill you, but Holly Dunn was an active participant in her own survival. The man who walked away from those tracks thought he had left a corpse behind. He had no idea that he had left someone behind who was going to help catch him. When Holly woke up, it was just silence. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, and when she opened her eyes, the man was gone. For a long time, she just lay motionless in the grass, listening, waiting. She had no way of knowing if he had truly vanished into the night or if he was still lurking, watching to see if she would move. So she waited, and when she was sure she was alone, her survival instincts took over again. Her injuries were incredibly bad. She was covered in blood, but she was conscious. And if you are conscious, you can move. Dragging herself to her feet, Holly staggered toward a distant porch light. Imagine opening your door in the middle of the night to find a college student on your doorstep, severely battered and pleading for help. The homeowners brought her inside and dialed 911 immediately. When paramedics and police arrived, her body was broken, but her mind was operating with terrifying clarity. Even as they tended to her wounds, she started recounting all of the details she had fought to collect: the man, the attack, his voice, the physical description, where she had left Cress. Her parents rushed to Lexington. When her younger sister Heather arrived at the hospital room, she said that she barely recognized Holly. Her face was so severely swollen, and her jaw and eye socket were fractured. Her scalp was being held together with staples. Surrounded by doctors, officers, frantic family, Holly began to notice a heavy, unnatural silence. No one was talking about Chris. She remembered that 52-pound rock. She remembered him struggling to breathe in the grass, but no one in the room would meet her eyes, and no one was answering her questions. Finally, Holly looked at her father and she asked the question everyone was avoiding. "Chris is dead, isn't he?" Her father told her yes. Chris Maier is gone. Now, after everything her body and mind had endured to survive that night, Holly was forced into another devastating reality. She had spent hours fighting for her life, and now she had to figure out how to live with the fact that she was the only one who survived. Survival carries its own kind of grief. She hadn't just nearly died beside those tracks, she had watched Chris die. Almost immediately, she began wrestling with the question that haunts survivors for generations. Why did I live when he didn't? They were attacked by the same man, bound in the same grass, yet Holly woke up and Chris never did. In those early weeks, her body demanded all of her focus. Her jaw was wired shut, her fractured eye socket required reconstructive surgery, and her scalp was stitched together. 5 days after the attack, her parents took her home to Indiana. While Holly lay recovering in her childhood bedroom, Chris's family was burying him, and because of her injuries, Holly couldn't attend Chris's funeral, an absence that cut deep. She was denied the ritual that people rely on to help them process loss, the chance to gather, acknowledge a life, and say a final goodbye. Instead, she was left at home to heal in a state of shock and emotional numbness. Her mind coped by compartmentalizing all of the trauma. First, she endured the physical recovery. Then she had to face Chris's death. Only later could she begin discussing her own near-death experience and sexual assault. There were days Holly wanted to pull the covers over her head and just never get out of bed. The person who kept pulling her back into the world was her sister, Heather. Heather became her rock, even while carrying her own irrational trauma, a heavy, quiet guilt that while Holly had been begging for her life in a railway bed, Heather was asleep in her own room. Trauma rarely obeys logic. And both sisters found themselves carrying guilt over a nightmare that neither of them created. Holly tried to force her life back on track. She returned to the University of Kentucky and tried to ignore the trauma, but you can only outrun a nightmare for so long. About a year later, the emotional dam broke, and Holly ended up joining a support group to face the suffocating guilt of being alive. Over time, she realized that overcoming survivor's guilt didn't mean she had to apologize for being alive. It meant that she could choose to live a life fully in honor of Chris and all of the victims that her attacker had robbed of a future. But she wasn't there yet, though. At just 20 years old, Holly was grieving, physically scarred, trying to process a violent trauma. And somewhere out there in the world, her attacker was still free. She didn't know his name. Police hadn't caught him yet. She had no idea if he even knew she was alive or if he might come back to finish what he'd started. Her body escaped those railroad tracks, but now she had to answer a much scarier question. How do you rebuild a life in a world that no longer feels safe? To Holly Dunn, the man beside the railroad tracks didn't have a name. She knew his face, his voice, his accent, the precise physical details she had forced herself to memorize. And investigators in Lexington had the blueprint that Holly had preserved. What no one understood yet was that her attacker wasn't confined to Kentucky. He had been moving silently across state borders for quite some time, illegally hopping on freight trains, leaving no paper trail, no rental cars, and buying no tickets. He struck near the tracks and vanished back onto the rails just as quickly. Eventually, he would gain a name, the Railroad Killer, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz. By late 1998, things escalated. In October, 87-year-old Leafy Mason was murdered in Hughes Springs, Texas. 2 months later, Dr. Claudia Benton was sexually assaulted and killed near tracks outside of Houston. In April of 1999, Reverend Norman Cernick and his wife Karen were murdered in their Weimar, Texas church. The railroad tracks ran directly behind the facility. These victims spanned all ages, all backgrounds, the weapons all varied, but the pattern was undeniable. They all had proximity to a railroad track, and that gave him the ability to disappear at will. Then, forensic evidence finally caught up with him. DNA linked Reséndiz to the Cernick murders, and investigators tied the same profile to the 1997 crime scene in Lexington. The stranger that Holly described from her hospital bed finally had a name. The attack on Holly and Chris wasn't isolated. She was just the sole survivor of an active serial killer. And in June of 1999, the violence surged again. Reséndiz murdered 26-year-old schoolteacher Naomi Dominguez and then 73-year-old Josephine Convica in Texas. Then he struck hundreds of miles north in Gorham, Illinois, killing 79-year-old George Morber and his 51-year-old daughter, Carolyn Frederick. The FBI stepped in. On June 21, 1999, Reséndiz was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list under the alias Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez. Over 200 investigators joined a massive, multi-agency task force. And the hunt intensified. But a devastating mistake came to light. On June 1st, 1999, while being wanted for multiple murders, Reséndiz had been detained by Border Patrol near Santa Teresa, New Mexico. Because the system databases aren't linked, agents processed and voluntarily returned him to Mexico, where he slipped back across the border just a few days later and killed 4 more people in June. For Holly, the horror had ballooned into an international crisis. The man who killed Chris and left her for dead was now the subject of a nationwide manhunt. And as long as he remained free and using those tracks, Holly lived with the terrifying reality. The man who tried to take her life knew she survived. And no one knew if he might try to finish what he started. On paper, Holly was safe in her home. But your trauma doesn't really care if you're actually safe. Someone outside was a man who had murdered her boyfriend, sexually assaulted her, stabbed her, beaten her within an inch of her life, and walked away. And nobody knew where he was. After August 28th, the entire world looked different to Holly. Before, a stranger was just somebody passing by. A train horn was a background noise, and a sound outside was just the wind. Now everything felt like a potential threat to her. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings. Holly fought off nightmares, dreaded being alone, and felt a jolt of panic every time a freight train rumbled in the distance. There was no cinematic turning point in her recovery, no single point where she woke up and decided that she was healed. Some days she wanted to fight, and other days she couldn't bring herself to get out of bed. When she returned to those classes at University of Kentucky, trying to step back into the life she had before was just impossible. Normal was gone. Holly carried a unique kind of terror that most survivors never have to face. Her attacker was still hunting other people. As news spread that Ángel Maturino Reséndiz, a roving serial murderer who hopped train to train, going from state to state, her fear became acute. At this point, she was sure he had to know she was alive, and so she lived with a constant, paralyzing dread that he would return. At night, Holly started sleeping with a knife under her pillow. Her family installed security cameras, and they carefully monitored who was allowed to come near her. But no alarm could give her the one thing she desperately craved: certainty. And no one could promise that he wouldn't show up at her doorstep. No one could promise that another stranger wouldn't hurt her. Before the attack, safety was an assumption. Afterward, it became something that Holly had to rebuild brick by brick, painfully learning to exist alongside her fear without letting it dictate every second of her life. With time, therapy, and the quiet devotion of her family, Holly began to find her footing again. But one massive hurdle stood between her and any real sense of peace. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was still there. And by the summer of 1999, Holly wasn't the only one looking over her shoulder. The entire nation was hunting for the railroad killer. I mean, at this point, he wasn't just Holly's nightmare. He was everybody's nightmare. This was almost a national panic. His face was plastered on the news every night. His name occupied a spot on the FBI's top most wanted. And residents who lived near rail lines across the country began sleeping with their locked windows and doors and loaded weapons. For Holly, the terror remained deeply personal. She knew what he was capable of because she had survived the violence, and she knew he was still alive. And then on July 13th, 1999, after weeks of just an unrelenting dragnet, the manhunt ended in a sudden surrender. Reséndiz walked across the international bridge from Ciudad Juarez into El Paso, Texas, where U.S. Marshals and Texas Rangers were waiting. The railroad killer was in handcuffs. For Holly, the immediate relief was undeniable. He couldn't appear outside of her window. He couldn't board another boxcar. No other family would lose a loved one to this man's rage. A heavy cell door now stood between Ángel Reséndiz and the rest of the world. Yet an arrest isn't a magic wand. Handcuffs don't erase nightmares. They don't undo physical scars or bring Chris back. And they don't instantly convince someone who has a hypervigilant nervous system that the threat is gone now. For Holly, custody brought a daunting new requirement. As his only living victim, she would be expected to step into a courtroom and recount the absolute worst night of her life. But Holly never hesitated. "I knew I was going to testify," she said. "I had always wanted to do that." She wanted justice for Chris, and she wanted the truth on record. But mentally, wanting to confront your attacker is very different from doing it in person. Holly had spent almost 2 years trying to put distance between herself and the man from those tracks. Now, to ensure he never walked free again, she was going to have to stand feet away from him and look him straight in the eye. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz went on trial in Houston, Texas in May of 2000. Despite the long trail of victims, he was tried specifically for the December 1998 murder of Dr. Claudia Benton, a physician and researcher who was killed inside of her home. Reséndiz never denied killing Dr. Benton. His defense was legal insanity, claiming he had severe paranoid schizophrenia, and it led him to believe that God commanded him to kill evil people. Prosecution experts countered that he was a little bit too organized. He was predatory, and this was a serial killer who fully understood the wrongfulness of his actions. And the jury agreed. After just 10 hours of deliberation, Reséndiz was found guilty of capital murder. The trial shifted to the sentencing phase to determine whether Reséndiz would face the death penalty based on his ongoing danger to the society. Prosecutor Devin Anderson laid out his killing spree in reverse chronological order, presenting crime scene photos, forensic files, and grieving families for victim after victim: Naomi Dominguez, Norman and Karen Cernick, Leafy Mason. And Anderson deliberately saved the final witness for last: Lexington, Chris Maier, and Holly Dunn. Holly was their only living witness, the only person who could sit before that jury and speak for herself. The night before her testimony in Houston, Holly woke up screaming and crying. She would later describe taking the stand as the hardest moment in her life, harder even than the attack itself. She was choosing to walk into a room with a man who had tried to take her life. Prosecutor Anderson gave her very strict instructions. "Don't look at him. Look at me. He's going to be on your left. Don't look at him." Holly took the stand, and Anderson began with a surprising opening question. "What'd you do last weekend, Holly?" Holly replied, "I graduated from college." Less than 3 years after Reséndiz left her for dead beside a railbed, Holly sat feet away from him, announcing that she had earned her degree from Kentucky. He hadn't destroyed her future. Then Holly recounted the night of August 28, 1997. She described the shadow stepping out of the darkness, watching Chris get bludgeoned, hearing Chris's laboring breaths in the grass, begging Reséndiz to turn his head so he wouldn't choke on his own blood. She recalled Reséndiz returning to tell her he was gone, followed by the sexual assault, the stab wound, the repeated strikes to her head. Holly cried during her testimony, and jurors wept openly while she spoke. Then came the final identification. Anderson asked if her attacker was in the room with them. Holly said yes. Anderson asked, "What's he wearing?" And Holly had no choice. She turned her head, breaking her gaze with the prosecutor for the first time, and looked into the face of Ángel Maturino Reséndiz. It was the first time since the attacks. He sat in a white button-down shirt with what she remembered was a smug expression. Waves of nausea rushed over Holly, but she held her composure, raised her hand, and pointed across the room. That's the man. The woman who had dug her fingernails into the soil so police could find her body was now sitting in a courtroom of law pointing out her attacker. And after her testimony, the punishment phase concluded very quickly. Reséndiz himself actually stated that he preferred execution to life in prison. And on May 22, 2000, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury sentenced Ángel Maturino Reséndiz to death. He would be executed June 27th, 2006. The verdict brought Holly relief. But the courtroom only delivers a legal outcome, not emotional restoration. And the death sentence wouldn't erase the trauma or bring Chris back. The jury had decided what would happen to Reséndiz. Holly still had to decide what would happen for her. Holly had faced her demon, testified before a jury, watched him get sentenced to death, earned her degree from the University of Kentucky. If this were a movie, the credits would start rolling here. But real trauma doesn't follow a screenplay. Survival happens in a single night. Recovery takes decades. Initially, the physical healing gave Holly something very tangible to focus on. Once she no longer could focus on physical recovery, emotional safety was something much harder. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every sudden noise was a trigger. Every distant train horn reminded her of the worst night. She had to learn that constantly anticipating danger isn't the same as actually being safe. There was no sudden inspirational turning point, and Holly didn't owe anyone a clean narrative arc. She was allowed to be angry, terrified, grieving. She was allowed to have good days followed by terrible ones, without pretending that what happened to her served some higher purpose. Eventually, though, Holly did reclaim something. She reclaimed her voice. She started speaking publicly about sexual assault, violent crime, and recovery. And in 2007, 10 years after the attack, she co-founded Holly's House. Holly's House is in her hometown of Evansville, Indiana. It's a nonprofit advocacy center designed to support victims of intimate partner violence, child abuse, and sexual assault. The philosophy was pretty simple. People who have experienced violence deserve a safe, compassionate space to heal, not an intimidating institutional system where they're forced to relive their trauma for strangers. Reséndiz had taken an ordinary location and turned it into a nightmare. Holly spent years building a physical refuge to give other people their safety back. I want to be clear here. Terrible things do not happen for a reason. Holly never needed to be assaulted, stabbed, or nearly murdered to become compassionate, and Chris didn't need to die to give her a purpose. What happened behind those tracks was senseless violence. But what Holly did with her life afterward was entirely her own. Ángel Reséndiz chose what he did to her. Holly chose what she would allow herself to become. In 2017, 20 years after the attack, Holly published her memoir, Soul Survivor, written with Heather Ebert. The book isn't just about what Reséndiz did. It details the long, quiet threshold of recovery, returning to school, seeking therapy, learning to trust again, finding hope. Surviving is something the body does in minutes. Recovery is a craft a person spends a lifetime learning. Holly Dunn could not control what happened to her beside those railroad tracks, but after having her safety violently stolen from her, she spent decades helping to create a world where other survivors could feel safe again. When Holly Dunn published Soul Survivor 20 years after the attack, she wasn't recounting a crime. She was reclaiming her own narrative. For 2 decades, her name had been reflexively tethered to Ángel Maturino Reséndiz. Search his name, and there she was, the survivor, the witness, the sole victim who lived. While factually accurate, the label is just so limiting. Imagine having the worst night of your life serving as your permanent introduction to the world. And her memoir gave her the space to tell the complete truth. Not just this is what he did to me, but this is what happened to me, and this is who I chose to be afterward. The title carries immense weight. Factually, Holly was the only person to survive an attack attributed to Reséndiz. Psychologically, being the sole survivor means carrying the devastating reality that others could not. That Chris could not. Holly would learn that healing did not require her to erase Chris Maier. Moving forward meant that she didn't have to leave him behind. And in her story, Chris remains who he always was. Funny, laid back, outdoorsy, 21, with his whole life ahead of him. The young man who, when faced with his own death, begged their attacker to spare Holly. That lets you know the kind of man that Chris Maier was. By sharing the unvarnished reality of grief, guilt, and recovery, Holly offered a lifeline to other survivors. She validated a truth that few can speak aloud. Healing isn't a straight line, and you don't have to pretend that a tragedy was a blessing in disguise to move past it. It's so easy to fall into the trap of saying, trauma makes us stronger. That a killer somehow forged the advocate that a survivor later becomes. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz might have made Holly Dunn a survivor, but everything that Holly did afterward was her own. He doesn't get credit for earning her degree, or standing in that Houston courtroom, or establishing a refuge for victims, or authoring a book. He didn't give her strength or empathy, he tried to destroy it. And with Soul Survivor, the relationship between victim and killer is permanently reversed. Ángel Reséndiz is no longer the main subject of a national tragedy. He is just a footnote in Holly Dunn's story. And Holly is the one who gets the last word. I want to end this story right where we started, beside those railroad tracks in Lexington, Kentucky, with 20-year-old Holly Dunn. Bound, terrified in the grass, watching her boyfriend draw his last breaths. Praying because she was sure her life was over too. She didn't know who the stranger was standing over her. She didn't know that his crime stretched across the country or that his name would one day strike panic into millions of Americans. In that dark field, none of that mattered. Holly was trying to prove that she was a human being. And she talked about her family, about his family. She watched every move he made, memorized his features, dug her fingernails into the dirt, because beneath the terror was a single stubborn thought: I want to live. Holly couldn't know if she would survive. She couldn't know that after being stabbed, assaulted, and beaten unconscious, she would open her eyes again in the night. She couldn't know she would find the strength to drag herself towards a distant light, still earn her college degree, stand in a Houston courtroom and identify her attacker, or spend decades building a refuge for other survivors. That night, Holly didn't know any of that. She only knew that she wanted to breathe, she wanted to see another morning, and she wanted another chance. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz left Holly Dunn beside those tracks because he believed that her story was over, and he was so wrong. Almost 30 years later, Holly isn't just the sole survivor of a serial killer. She's the woman who got back up, the woman who remembered, the woman who testified, the woman who took a life someone tried to steal and made sure every remaining chapter belonged entirely to her. Reséndiz left fingerprints, physical evidence, and a trail of boxcar routes across America, but he also left behind the one thing he never intended to: a witness. The truth always leaves a trail, and Holly Dunn lived to tell us where that trail ended. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. See you next week.